Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We are incredibly grateful today to welcome Dr. Stephen Hicks. Dr. Hicks is a professor of philosophy, author of 7 books, and a frequent opiner on postmodernism, liberalism, and the Enlightenment. And Dr. Hicks, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
No, well, thanks for the invitation. Looking forward.
Good. Brian, I'm going to kick it off to you. We've had a lot of conversations in the past about postmodernism, and there's some special angles that I think we want to get Dr. Hicks's perspective on. So if you want to tee us up.
No, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Hicks, for your time and your expertise. Uh, I want to start by saying I've had probably a dozen or more conversations with you already in my head, and they've all been very fruitful,
Nice. Yeah.
which may be relevant to today's topic, oddly enough. But we said that we wanted to talk about postmodernism, and our regular theme here is about helping people make sense of what they see in their
Mm,
everyday lives, like what's going on. And we've sort of identified that postmodernism has been a thread that has been running through. But rather than jumping right at that, you share something that I think we and all of our guests sort of share as a given, and that is the idea that philosophy is important,
mm. Oh, yeah.
that that our world is formed by philosophy in ways that we don't often understand or see directly. And so I think that we are part of this great uh, brotherhood that I see nowadays, of people that are trying to bring philosophy back to a relevance that maybe
Wonderful.
has escaped a lot of people nowadays.
Sure. Sure.
And so,
That would
so
may not
thank
simply be an escape. It may that our population is growing and the world in some ways is becoming simpler, but also more complex. So the philosophy project is always in need of renewing itself.
And the philosophy project, I would argue, and I'm interested in your opinion, is maybe more relevant today for a reason that has been sort of developing through history.
Mm,
To paint our topic maybe in the broadest picture, when a human being comes into consciousness as a newborn, it seems that the creation of the self creates this distinction between the inside and the outside. There's, the stomach, and you're hungry, and that's on the inside, and then, so you scream to the outside, and then the nipple comes, and now this interaction between the outside and the inside seems to they're tangled up.
mhm.
And then as we come to individuality, that relationship between the inside and the outside becomes something that we have to navigate psychologically.
Mhm.
And, one of the famous Chinese philosophers, Chuang-Tzu, he said, if I make myself happy, then I make the people around me sad. And if I make them happy, I make myself sad. And there seems to be
Uh-oh.
this dynamic tension between the self and the world at large that then ends up in politics in the tension between the individual and the collective. It seems
Let me
like this theme's been going through history. Does that just
okay.
track?
Yeah, well, I think the first part of that I think is very well said about the development of consciousness, a distinction between subject, object, and then self and other more narrowly, because subject and object is me and the world in general. I want to have a little pause when you introduce the word tension, because that is a kind of conflict concept. I would say at the same time, there are tensions that develop, but at the same time, mutualities and cooperations and concordances. So I think it is broader than that. And then partly, then as we grow to more conceptual maturity, we're trying to figure out how to make the win-wins or the mutualities stronger, and how to deal with the discords or the tensions and make them go away. And then, as you say, that does, at least in one significant subset, play out in politics. And sometimes politics is a matter of individual versus collective. Sometimes it's individual versus individual or collective versus collective. So there's a whole other complex there as well.
And it gets related to this subject object thing, right? Because it seems like
Well,
in the story of philosophy, we have philosophers saying, well, it's really all subject. And the
yeah,
object part is just a function of the subject. And then we have the opposite
mm,
side saying, well, it's all object and the subject part is not quite real. And then there's
yeah.
so there's a dialogue there through time, isn't there?
Okay. No, I think that's also nicely said, articulating two of the three positions. So there's a strong everything object, no subject, or you try to dissolve the subject into the object. And then another option is to say there is everything subjective and the object is inaccessible, or I just dissolve the object into the subject. Uh, but I do think this is the position I'm going to articulate and do articulate is that the relationship, there are objects. The subject, once it's responsive to the object, does have its own nature and starts to develop. And the question is about maintaining the proper development and relationship between the two. So if you think like in cognitive terms, like if we just focus on one set of issues there's one school of philosophy on this relation between subject and object that will try to say what we need to do if we're going to have knowledge, real knowledge, true knowledge, genuine knowledge, is completely shut down the subject, right? Dissociate from the body, turn off your senses, make your mind blank, and then the object, the big O object, God, is then going to just completely speak to your mind, and you'll have this direct revelation, so to speak. And then we can talk about knowledge. Now, to fit with your schema, right, what that position is saying is everything should be intrinsically on the object side, and the subject should be nothing in particular to begin with, and then knowledge is a forming of the subject. Now, in epistemology, we call that position intrinsicism. And then the opposite position wants to come along and say, well, it doesn't seem like this subject can be shut down entirely. We have a body, we have a mind, maybe we have these internal cognitive structures. By the time we start to become philosophical, we've got experiences and memories and beliefs, and we've been conditioned socially in certain ways. So the subject seems pretty robust. And those who then start to worry about the subject being robust then will reach various skeptical conclusions. They'll say, well, it's impossible for us then, because the subject is so robust, to have any access at all to reality or something outside. Right? It's always going to be filtered and shaped or run through biases and so on. So really, when we're talking about knowledge, all it is just subjective bias or subjective construct. And we can't even talk about reality at all. So then coming back to your schema, the initial schema, what we've got then is two positions. One is saying, really, we should have no subject, no self, and reality should just imprint itself upon us. And the other side is saying, well, everything just is self, everything just is subject, and we can't even talk about the nature of reality at all. Now, I think both of those are sophisticated positions that have come down to us, but neither of them is true. That the right way to approach is to say, the way you started, Brian, was saying, well, there are objects, but we also, as a human being at birth, we are another object, but we're a special kind of object that has certain kinds of cognitive faculties at birth that start to then react and be responsive as they interact with other objects. And then we start to talk about a subject. Consciousness arises, awareness arises, self-consciousness arises, a sense of agency arises. So the subject does develop and become contact. And then the interesting cognitive question, though, is how do we use those cognitive apparatuses that we have, our senses, our memory, our capacity for abstraction, for using language, logic, mathematics in such a way such that, yes, we are cognitively active. We have a self, we have a subject, but we are maintaining the connection of what's going on inside the subject to reality. That's the project. And that any position that ends up saying, well, we have to try to dissolve the subject in order to let reality in, that's already a mistake. And any position that also says, oh, we have a subject and it's operative, so therefore there's no way to get past the subject to get to reality, that's another mistake. But those mistakes, I think, come in very sophisticated form. And where we are right now is then in a broad three-way debate between, I'm going to impose my labels on it now, right? What I think of as a strong intrinsicist position. Everything is on the object side, and we need to dissolve the subject to let the object speak, so that, that we somehow have a mind meld with intrinsic reality, and that's what we're striving for. And I think that's a wrong standard, but I call that intrinsicism. Another side that says, no, reality is there, and we are responsive to it with our cognitive capacities, but we have to learn and be very careful in using our cognitive capacities in order to maintain a right relationship to reality cognitively. That's a lot of work, and we're still learning about a lot of that. But that's the ongoing project versus, and I'm calling that objectivism, small o objectivism, maintaining the contact of my mind with objects in reality. And then the third position ends up kind of being, I don't know, disappointed. We don't see how this objective project can work. And so we're just going to collapse into some sort of skeptical subjectivism and not even try to talk about truth and knowledge and facts anymore. So that's uh, flying over the territory at a high level, like what I see as the three competing positions now.
Which sort of amounts to slapping into the guardrail on one side of the highway, slapping into it on the other side of the highway, or negotiating your way down the highway,
Nice, nice.
so to speak.
Okay. So yeah, that's a nice self-correcting metaphor as we are traveling along, and hopefully we're learning as we go along that we slapped into this guardrail right at one point, how to correct so we don't do that again.
Right. Now, one of the arguments that shows up, and this typically shows up to me in my encounters with what I attribute to be postmodernism,
Okay.
is that, and the reason that I started the way that I did is because I wanted to set things on a psychological footing. And that is because, as you say, we have to be very careful to learn how to navigate our car down the middle of that highway. But my argument is going to be that where we are in our psychological development might tend to want to pull the wheel one way or the other, and that there's actually like a driving school that I would say is a process to make us a fit vessel for truth, to make us into philosophers, so
Nice,
that we
nice.
see whether our car pulls left or pulls right, and that we have a sort of a self-monitoring mechanism to
Mm.
see. Does that track for your
Oh,
picture?
yeah. No, I think that your driving down the highway metaphor is very rich, and we can unpack it, and we can actually see how far we can go with this. But yes, no,
Till we run out of gas.
yeah. So some sort of, there has to be a mystical insight is one guardrail, and the other side is everything is just subjective and we make it up. That's the other guardrail. But then at the same time, we're in this very complicated piece of machinery, the car, right, going down the highway, and we are learning how to navigate it. And part of that is recognizing that we do have some agency and control over the vehicle. Of course, we don't control everything about the vehicle, but we do have some. And then being able to self-monitor how we are trying to control the vehicle as we are going down the road. So I think that tracks very well. I don't know if you want to drill down and say it could be a standard transmission. There's the clutch. I might not. Oh, really? Because sometimes we can just think in our minds abstractly in fantasy imagination, but we don't engage, right? So it's like we've got the clutch in on the car, right? And at some point
Right.
you can see we can release the clutch and the car engages, right? Or I can steer the wheel this way to make the car go more this way or to keep it on the straight and narrow. I can change the gears. My mind's working faster or slower, right? So yeah, there's a lot of richness there.
I I I want to follow this metaphor, but there's a point of clarification that I need, and presumably our listeners might too. Dr. Hicks, you referred to one guardrail as needing a mystical revelation, and you had spoken to that prior, where if you make the subjective a blank slate, then apprehending reality is essentially a religious experience, right? You mentioned God even, whereas would have assumed that that guardrail is actually the God um, of objectivity or rationalism, where science, for example, might be the arbiter, not God. And so I'm surprised that you went to the mystical and
Mm.
religious on that guardrail, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes. Look, the difference is, if you take kind of classical mystical religions as the exemplar of this tradition, then what they will all say is the subject does need to be dissolved. Right? So they are going to emphasize, fasting of the body, shutting down the senses, right? Making your mind a blank slate, not to think about anything. And then,
Gelassenheit.
yeah,
Yeah.
then the revelation hopefully will come to you. So that's why I went to the religious example. Now I would say why not the science example is because the scientific project from the get-go wants to say there is an intrinsic reality out there, but we're not trying to shut down the mind because the mind has to be active. You have to look at reality. You have to make a decision. I'm going to focus on this, and I'm going to not focus on these other things, pay careful attention. So that's keeping my mind active. And then I'm going to say, I've got memories. Oh, this reminds me of this other thing. And then I bring that thing to memory and I say, well, it's similar or it's different. And if it's similar enough, then I'm going to form a new category. Right? And then I'm going to assign a label to that category. And then maybe I'm going to run an experiment and then gather the data and do a statistical analysis. So this I see as, yes, we're trying to be responsive to intrinsic reality, but the subject is still very active in using its apparatus. And if I am using my apparatus actively in the right ways, then I get something that's called knowledge. And so I think that's a very different enterprise from the religious mystic enterprise. And that's just meant
Right.
as a clarification for
Now,
Boaz.
now I wanted to throw another thread in there because I feel that it's kind of antidotal to the dichotomy. And I told you before we started the episode, I mentioned to Dr. Hicks that I had left college when I was told that things could mean anything to anybody. And one of the reasons that rubbed me was because I had come out of a tradition, for example, a martial arts tradition, where yes, we had theory, but the test came for me ultimately, could I throw a guy out of the bar who was 10 inches taller than me?
Mm.
Um, I studied, I was trained in psychotherapy. And there are the theories of psychotherapy, but then there is the patient and the interaction with the patient, and does their life change in a better way or not? And, we hear a lot, particularly, for example, in the study of ancient philosophy, we hear a lot about Sophia, wisdom, in an absolute knowledge sense and often in a propositional sense, but we don't hear as much about phronesis. And Phronesis is one of my Aristotelian one-string banjo songs. Because, I studied with this master, this guy who lived through 2 tours of combat in Vietnam, and so
Mm,
there was a certain hands-on expertise about which the proof was in the pudding, as we used to say.
mm,
Um, when later on, both myself and Boaz, to a degree also, I worked with Dr. Jorge Gonzalez Ramirez, who is a traditional Amazonian shaman for about, over a period of about 15 years. Um, both of these things are interesting in that they're lineages, but they work in a way that I think Francis Bacon would approve of. And the metaphor that I have given before is like of golf, where we stand at the tee, we have a vague idea of where the flag is, we give it as good a whack as we can, and then we go and we see what we've done. And from that new viewpoint, we look, and now we might see a water trap or a sand trap that we couldn't see from the tee.
mhm,
We might have a clear view of the pin, and so we take another whack.
mhm,
And we don't know how many par this hole is, and some of these holes are intergenerational, where we've handed clubs off. Uh, but the idea is that we don't want to hit it back towards the tee. We want to get closer to the flag, and that there's a reiterative process there
mhm.
that's forcing us in the golf game literally to touch grass, as people like to say nowadays.
Nice, nice.
And so what I'm wondering, do you think phronesis, or were we open and vulnerable to postmodernism, which maybe I should back up? Um, when you were talking about idealism, you mentioned this, what I thought was a reference to Immanuel Kant, where noumena and phenomena were separated forever. And it seems like we entered this really slippery slope that by the time we get to Heidegger, language is out of control, and I'm not sure where reality is anymore. And I'm wondering, can we rescue some value out of the subjective world if we have that frenetic tether? Can
Mm.
we pound a philosophical piton back with Aristotle and Phronesis and lower ourselves into subjectivity as long as we have that tether of Phronesis to bring us back to the acid test of reality, do you think? I know that's a long-winded question.
Okay. You are a man, Brian, of many metaphors, right? From the driving to the golf to the mountain climbing now. All right. No, I think that makes the enterprise very, very rich. Um, okay. So, yeah, you're putting your finger on, I think, a few different things, but and weaving them together. You start with the ancients. I think you're right to say that one of the um, ancient approaches to philosophy that is still with us, but was strong in the ancient times, was a non-phronesis based approach that already at the origins of philosophy, maybe because philosophy is developing out of earlier religions and there's a whole developmental story there as well. But already we have this distinction between the real practical world, the grass, right, that you are talking about, the concern for acting and acting successfully in the world with being experimental, trial and error, all of that stuff. That in this tradition already that has been dropped. And we have a kind of dualism at work. There is some sort of higher reality or a higher world, a place where knowledge is absolute, to use one of the words that you entered in there, and that this absolute standard then comes to be the touch point by which we're evaluating everything that we are doing in philosophy. Right. So, in some sense, we're not concerned with practicality. We're not thinking that should have to do experiments. There should be some way to get to a godlike perspective on reality, and that's what we are striving for. And then if we ask, well, what is this godlike perspective? Well, God is like a giant mind who knows everything. He knows everything perfectly. He knows past, present, and future. He does it effortlessly. And so I, as the philosopher who wants to aspire to this absolute knowledge, the question then is, how can I become God-like? And I've already eliminated a lot of things from my philosophy. So to put labels to it, I do think it's fair to say that someone like Plato is tilting strongly in that direction. Right? We separate the messy world of particular things that are always changing and coming into existence and going out of existence. And that can't be what we're really trying to know, because it's messy and it's imperfect and so on. So there must be some higher reality that's perfect and absolute. And that's what I'm striving for. If my senses are connecting me with this messy physical world, well, I must have some other cognitive capacity that's purified of physical things, and I need to cultivate that capacity in order to get this true knowledge. And then I think you're exactly right to say that Aristotle's emphasis on phronesis as the standard for a human being to aspire to is already directly challenging that Platonic conception in a number of directions. Because, as it is saying, phronesis is about acting well in the world. And so already we are interested in this world. We're already recognizing that there's going to be a process involved, and some people are going to do it better and some people are going to do it worse. And that we can learn from some people, including learning from their mistakes. That I have to engage in this process to develop myself, to develop my capacities. And as you say in your golf metaphor, it's going to be a matter of playing the whole course, 18 holes. And at each point, it's a little bit different. There are some generalized skills, but they have to be customized to the particular circumstances. And I'm always learning. And that's a very different standard from the get-go of what knowledge and the process of acquiring knowledge is going to be. So if we take that, and then you mentioned Francis Bacon, I would say, yeah, very much so. I am anti-Platonic at this level, very much in that Aristotelian, Baconian project. But of course, we still have the Platonic project with us. We still do have the Aristotelian, Baconian project with us. And there are good arguments. We come back to the guardrails issue. Sometimes we go down a road and it takes us in a more Platonic direction. And either we then say, well, that's got to be right then, we become Platonists for a little while, or we say, we must have made a mistake somewhere because we've left all of reality behind. We've left human life behind. We have to figure out what the mistake is to get back to the real world. And then, of course, along the way, we can say, well, we know there's lots of people. This is a lot of hard work, and I'm not seeing like I'm making headway. It's an impossible project, so I'm just going to throw up my hands and say everything is subjective and so on. So I'm very sympathetic to the direction you're going.
So did the angelic doctor poke a hole through that guardrail? With that experience at the end of his life when he kind of set down the pen and it seemed like something radically different had happened in his perspective. Because one of my regular banjo songs is that important knowledge is dispositional, not just propositional. And it seemed to me that what happened to when I mentioned for our listeners, when I talk about the angelic doctor, I'm talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, who had an experience at the end of his life that caused him to put down his pen. And he was an Aristotelian, or a re-Aristotelian, maybe we could call him. But what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, the more general point about Aquinas is partly intellectual historical. So Western intellectual tradition had been dominated by a kind of Platonic Christianity for probably 700 or 800 years by the time Aquinas is born in the early 1200s. And so his intellectual historical importance is that as some of the newer Greek and Roman, more secular, worldly texts come to life, particularly Aristotelian texts. I mean, they had the logic texts, but not very much of anything else. Plus the awareness that the Romans had built these magnificent civilizations without any Christianity. How is this possible? So maybe there is something to these traditions, and so Aquinas is important in trying to integrate Christianity with Aristotelianism. And I think that in part opens the door to the Renaissance. I think it takes Christianity in a much more worldly, naturalistic, rational, healthy direction. I'm not a Christian, but I think that version of Christianity is much, much better than the alternative. But as you say, Aquinas was on a philosophical journey his entire life. And as you earlier described, right, eloquently, that means sometimes you're going this way, sometimes you're going that way. And it's entirely possible that by developing a certain line of thought, he reached a point where it seemed like a kind of Platonism was more appropriate on that particular issue. And so that would then mean his Aristotelian project, right, has ended. Right? Or it could be that he was elderly and not in particularly good health. There's a huge tiredness component. You know, I'm done, and I'm putting my pen down, and the book stands. And I think that would require more knowledge of him and his particular
Than we may
circumstances than
have.
I have.
Yeah, yeah. Did
So,
you have
so
something, Bo?
would we say that to bring postmodernism in a little more directly, would we say that um, the mistake of postmodernism is a movement away, too far away, or entirely away from the objective, and um, and how does phronesis help us get the car back into the middle of the highway, in your view?
Yeah. So yeah, postmodernism is complicated. I think there are different postmoderns for whom different parts of the overall philosophical package are important. So I think some postmoderns come because they try to do metaphysics, and then they come to think the metaphysics project is impossible. So they become anti-realist. Let's just forget metaphysics, right, and so on. For some, the route is through cognitive issues, epistemological issues. And they come then to think, knowledge, objectivity, truth, all of those success concepts can't be maintained. And so I'm going to be postmodern for those reasons as well. Some, I think, come to it through ethics concerns. One of the very interesting substrains is the idea that we should kind of valorize suffering and pain and conflict, not necessarily political stuff, just that life is in some sense tragic and it ultimately doesn't make sense. But they deeply feel these value concerns. And so they feel highly alienated from a modern world that sees itself very optimistic, progressive. Science and technology are making the world a better place for them. That just is a deep, alienating philosophical perspective to take, and they're opposed to that. And I do think some of the postmoderns, the thing nearest and dearest to their hearts is politics. I don't think it's an accident at all that all of the leading postmoderns of the first generation, Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, Rory, are all from as far left on the left perspective as you can possibly get. And that the crushing political disappointments of the far left agenda is the thing that really is driving them to say, excuse my language, fuck the world. I am going to be entirely negative in my overview. Now, Boas's question then, I think, is right on the positive side, that the objectivity issue, getting too far away from objectivity, is the core problem. And I think it's true of the first generation postmoderns that probably is one of the two biggest things for them. So again, somewhat biographically, all of them, the ones I named, were PhDs in philosophy. So that's Foucault, Lyotard, Rorty, Derrida. And more narrowly, all of them are doing their dissertations on cognitive and epistemological issues. And there, the concept of objectivity is front and center. And all of them, partly because of where philosophy was in the 1940s, 1950s, as they are smart young guys getting their PhDs from very good universities, all of philosophy was at a very skeptical moment. Right? The logical positivism is collapsing. Classical pragmatism has collapsed. We've got Heidegger on the continent with his strongly anti-logic, anti-rational philosophy dominating and so on. So it does make sense that for them, reaching kind of state-of-the-art, negative, skeptical conclusions about cognition and the possibility of objectivity then speaks exactly to Boaz's question. Once you say it's not just that, well, we've had some hypotheses about the scientific method and objectivity that haven't worked out. I guess we need to go back to the drawing board and come up with some better theories of objectivity. We have a group of young people who are saying, more generally, the whole project is impossible. On principle, so to speak, we just have to abandon science, objectivity, truth, logic, mathematics, and the whole shebang. And that then is the key move that's worth exploring. And I do think it's interesting, partly philosophically, but also then partly psychologically, to come back to Brian's framing. There is a difference, I think, between people who say, here's a hypothesis about, say, a philosophical hypothesis about objectivity with respect to concepts or mathematics or logic. And I've thought a lot and I've read a huge amount of stuff. And I come to the point where I think, this hypothesis just doesn't work. It fails. Right? And then the question is, what's your reaction to that failure? Is your reaction then to say, well, therefore, I guess I need a better hypothesis to figure out how objectivity works? We need a better theory of logic or better mathematics or grounding for mathematics or whatever. And that's one move, right? But then the presupposition there is, well, I still think cognition can be successful with respect to coming to know reality. We just need to work on this ongoing scientific project versus someone who reaches that point of failure. This hypothesis is a failure, and they're so devastated by it that they then go to the negative generalization. I'm not going to try a new hypothesis. I'm just going to say this whole branch of philosophy is just dismissive, and I'm just going to go and do something else. Or, and this might even be darker, I'm going to spend my life trying to attack anybody who thinks this is possibly a project worth pursuing. So that, I think, is some important territory to explore. Now, the second part of Boaz's question then was to say, more positively then, could phronesis or some updated Aristotelian, Baconian phronesis project be a corrective? And I want to say yes, and I think that would work for the vast majority of people, because I think the vast majority of people who, especially when they are young, they're trying to figure out their philosophy of life, what their values are, how they're going to use their minds for the whole rest of their life. They're still flexible and they're still wanting to make their lives successful. And they're still working on the idea that philosophy should be able to help me do so. That's why they're studying philosophy, say, in university. And so if it is presented to them that, well, you're going to run into a lot of failed philosophical hypotheses. You're going to run into a certain number of dead ends. You're going to run into a certain number of failures, but pick yourself up and try again. And what we're doing when we're teaching philosophy, including the failure philosophies, is trying to accelerate your process so you can see how the really smart people before you, right, went down this road and it didn't work. Right. So, all right. So you didn't have to spend 3 years going down that road. You can go 3 weeks down that road reading so and so's book and then realizing the problem. Okay, so that doesn't work. So now I'm going to try this other failure and so on. So you can run, so to speak, 20 philosophical experiments during the course of your undergraduate career instead of trying to do that over the course of your life. But all of that, though, is still governed by the Phronesis label. If I don't want to put too many words in your mouth, that philosophy is about helping you live a better life in the real world, and that is the governing philosophy. Now, I want to say that I think that works for most, but I don't think it's going to work for everyone because already that framing is a philosophical commitment that you're trying to build into your educational program. And one of the things you do have to do is step back and say, well, there are skeptical arguments and criticisms of that framing. And part of the education has to be to take into account those criticisms explicitly. And that means you're still going to run the risk that many of your students will think the criticisms of the Phronesis project get the better of it. And so they're still going to abandon it. So I think it's the healthiest, but I don't think there are any guarantees in philosophy. Um, I think that's partly why we're still having the debates that we are, thousands of years later.
Right. Well, and it seems like, something about the postmodern uh, angle, as it shows up in society, seems extremely reactive.
Hmm.
And when I look at it as it manifests, what comes to me from having been trained, years ago as a psychotherapist, is that, growing up is hard. And I think growing up today is harder probably than it ever was. And I think that that may make certain worldviews more appealing.
Hmm.
That there is a certain, for example, in the martial arts tradition that I was in, we had a saying that said that soft students have to be hardened and hard students have to be softened.
Hmm.
With this idea that you kind of have to go through a process before you're going to be able to handle the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So that, like I'm wading my way through Being in Time now by Heidegger, and I can't help now. I agree with Nietzsche. It feels like he's ontologizing his psychology.
Hmm. Okay.
And I think, you know what I mean, when Nietzsche makes that claim. And I guess I feel like that's what I see happening there.
Yeah. Okay. So that's three things.
Sorry.
So one of them was this issue of the postmodernists and the sense that it's a reactive philosophy, right? Instead of an active philosophy or proactive, whatever the contrasts would be. A
Nietzsche's
second one about
resentment.
whether growing up now is more difficult, which is then going to make the education philosophy project more difficult for young people and then set them up perhaps for failures in larger numbers or more easily. That's an interesting issue. And then the Nietzsche Heidegger contrast, where in some ways, I think, Heidegger is carrying on a Nietzschean project in some ways. I think Nietzsche would sneer at Heidegger for exactly the reasons that you're talking about. So, which of those three should we take up? Because I think each of those is rich unto itself. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
wherever you feel is
I
the most fertile. Or
okay, let's start with the reactive one. I think that's fair, and I think that is a good assessment. Let me try an analogy. So if we think about religion, for example, one thing that we know from the history of religions as we get into the modern world and we want more people to think about religion and explore different religions and make up their own kind of religious philosophy, right, so to speak. that in many ways that project is different from the way it was in the past, where everybody believes the same thing and it just comes from this more or less top-down. So you're not at all encouraged to think about it. It functions like the air you breathe, slightly overstating things. But then we know that religion is complicated. It's trying to deal with all sorts of philosophical issues. It also has a praxis and a whole social philosophy typically bundled in with it. And so we started asking people to think through everything. We're moderns now. You have agency. You have a big brain. Everybody can read and think about all of the big issues and so on. And we know that that is, in some cases, highly liberating for young people. Right? They're active-minded. They like thinking about all of these issues. They've got this strong sense of agency. They really want to figure out the truth. For other people, by the time they become a little older, it seems like a burden. Right? They don't want to have to think about these things, and they are irritated by people who are constantly pestering them for what they see as problems with their worldview and their religion and so on. They just want those problems to go away. So there is a kind of reactiveness that is going to be built into the psychology of a certain number of people just on these religious issues. I believe what I want to believe, and you people are encouraging me to question everything that I believe and maybe even to change my mind. And then there are going to be lots of defensive reactions that go on inside that kind of a religious mindset. So that's one kind of reactiveness out of religion. Just park that to the side for a moment. Another, I think, is a more active-minded person. I'm a young person, and I grew up believing in a certain religion. And I think it's true. I think it's beautiful. I think it points to a certain kind of nobility for human beings. But I'm really smart, and I start reading all of these other philosophers and the other religions. And by golly, there's lots of really smart people who have been criticizing my religion, coming up with stuff that I never would have thought of before. And I don't know how to answer all of those objections. And when I think honestly, it seems like maybe a lot of those objections do get the better of my religion. And I'm faced then with the alternative of having to alter my religion significantly, coming to believe something else, or coming to be an atheist or an agnostic. There's going to be huge social costs imposed upon me by people if I do this in my circle. And I then experience a kind of crisis of faith as a result of all of this. And we know this is a very common phenomena. And again, the reaction, this is the reactive word, the reactive element to the crisis of faith can take various forms that lead people to become very hostile to logic, reason, philosophical project, the idea of dialogue and self-improvement and self-correction and so on. The reaction will be a hard line. I reject all of that, and I just reaffirm very dogmatically, vociferously, and sometimes angrily my commitment to my religion. So that's the reactive thing. We're familiar with all of those dynamics from reading the history of religion. So when we turn to the postmoderns, they're not typically religious as young people. Right? Already they are secular, they're agnostic, some of them are atheists. So here I think what's important for this reactive strain that is there, I think is not religion, but politics. I think the demographic that is much more attracted here is young people who, when they are intellectually active, they grow up in a political framework. Now, it might be that they grew up in a kind of a subculture or a monoculture where they're only exposed to one political viewpoint in the world, right? Or they're a little more active-minded and they did some exploring, but they made a commitment to a political framework that they think, again, is true, noble, is idealistic, and so forth. But it comes to form, their identity. This is me. I am my politics deep all of the way through. The same way for other people, I am my religion deep and all of the way through. But I'm a smart person, I'm active-minded, and I am in a world in which now I start to read all of these people who are critical of my politics from different political perspectives. And by golly, they've got some really good criticisms of my politics. And maybe if I've learned some history, I look at the historical track record of my politics, And it seems like one failure after another, one disaster after another. And I'm only 18 years old or 19 years old. So all of this history really is new to me. And all of these super smart criticisms of my political presuppositions are relatively new to me. That at the same time, that can generate a crisis psychologically, a kind of crisis of faith of my political views. And I think exactly again, the same reactive psychological things can occur in political form. So then I strike out against people who say that I have to learn from the history, or that I have to learn the logic and the statistics and do all of these analysis, and the statistics don't seem to be supporting my position. And I have to be open-minded and debate all of these people from different political perspectives and so on. I don't want to do that. I double down, I triple down, I become angry, I become attacking, and I use every device known to me rhetorically and sometimes physically to shut down any opposition to my political framework. So I think the history of religion and the history of politics, right, play out in a way that provides evidence exactly for this reactive streak that you are talking about. And I think in the postmoderns, I think there is a difference, again, psychologically, between those who come to the postmodernism more through the route of just philosophy. I'm interested in metaphysics and epistemology and all of these very interesting issues. And, I guess I'm a kind of a skeptic. I don't see how any of the positive answers work, but okay, that's just the way it is. All right, nobody really knows anything. I'm just going to get on with my life, and I'm still sort of cool, right, about it. Versus those who come to their postmodernism through a political commitment first, and then for them, right, they're already charged up with their politics, the way politics gets our juices going. And I'm a little bit combative, right? And then for them, postmodernism comes to be an intellectual weapon that they are using really for their politics. So that hot and cool postmodernism partly might also be explained psychologically as well. Now, that's just the first part of your question on the reactiveness. I wonder about the difficulty now compared to the difficulty in earlier generations. I think there's I I I want to say in some ways yes, in some ways no, and that's kind of a weaselly answer. But let me
It's always true.
let me say, in some ways, I want to say before life was hard. I mean, so you look at the life expectancy statistics, or that, and just in those shorter lives, the amount of pain and stifling of any kind of youthful ambition that you had. So I want to say that life was hard and it ground people down a lot sooner than now. So I think in a lot of ways, life now is easier in all of the obvious ways. We just don't have to worry about so many things that used to just cause people misery and death, right? For a long. So in that respect, if we start to then say, well, what about other areas? Do we want to say that now? Say I don't know. So think about young women. Now life is more difficult for young women compared to life for young women before, when you didn't get an education, you weren't allowed to control your own money, you couldn't leave the house without permission, you didn't get to choose your dating partners and your marriage partners and so on. So we take that stereotype, which was true for a significant number of women right in the past. I would say, well, that's actually kind of a hard life in the perhaps in the most important sense, that what makes you human is being able to make choices in all of those areas. And so you are dehumanized right from the very beginning. And if we want to contrapose that to say, well, now you're a young woman and I'll try to put it in negative terms. Now you have to think about politics and decide who you're going to vote for. Politics is this big, ugly mess of sometimes unsavory candidates, and you have to make all of these lesser of two evil choices, and that's kind of hard. And you have to put yourself out there on the dating market. And have you seen what guys are, right? And there's so many of them are underdeveloped and immature and blah blah blah, and You have to kiss a dozen princes before you find it. So it's really hard, right? And so on. And
Yeah.
the 50% divorce rate, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways of painting the world that young women now have with all of the choices, and just emphasize all of the negative things that go into that as well. So to step back, though, I think to make the big overall judgment is to say, I want to come down on the side of saying uh, your value standard has to be an understanding of what it is to live a fully human life. That has to be our framework. And to the extent that we say we're going to take away certain aspects of your humanity and close off certain options to you on principle right from the get-go to make your life easier, that's a mistake. Right? Any sort of strong paternalism or strong authoritarianism philosophically is a mistake. And that what we need to focus on is the positive, that life is potentially rich and multifaceted, and that it does require a lot of choice making and a lot of agency development. But that is the essence of the human project. And you have to go into it knowing that that's going to be often messy and frustrating, and there will be a lot of disappointments. And part then of developing young people in these times where, yes, lots of choices, lots of options, we are expecting you to develop yourself a lot more. Part of that involves developing them with the capacity to deal with frustrations that people didn't have to deal with in the past, to deal with,
Yeah.
say, a higher rate of failed experiments than people had to deal with in the past. But at the same time, that's also nested in a judgment that human beings are capable of this. And I think it should be normalized that we expect human beings to do better and be more skilled, more knowledgeable, more entrepreneurial about their lives than, say, our grandparents
Well,
were.
well,
So
and
I
that's
would,
that story.
yeah,
That's
go
that
ahead.
story through history of the individual versus the collective.
Yeah,
And
or
the
some
movement,
collective.
it
Yeah,
seems, has been putting more on the individual, which is
yeah,
also why the individual needs philosophy more than they ever have.
absolutely.
But we have more choice as the
Yes.
empowerment of that individuality comes, and that choice is maybe more cognitively challenging. That's probably the way I should have put it.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, education then becomes absolutely right important here. And then this is not quite philosophical. Philosophy is in the background. Partly it's then going to be institutional. One of the challenges young people have, I think, in this generation is that they are in this world that's actually full of opportunities and entrepreneurial agency, and we are incredibly rich in so many ways. But the fact that so many young people don't feel up to the challenge, they find that alienating, scary. I think it's an indictment of our largely dysfunctional education system. Uh, in some cases, it's an anti-education system that we are putting young people through. So that was your second comment, right, about things being harder or not.
Uh-huh.
Then the third one was the imagined Heidegger Nietzsche dialogue, and I don't know
Right.
if you want if that was a just a tack
Let
on point or something you would like to explore.
Well, let me slip a point in about the education. And that
Yeah.
is, I wanted to mention that you're working with the Peterson Academy.
Yes.
And honestly, my picture reading the big patterns is that that's what the future is for
Mm,
education.
okay.
And that really is the direction we need to move. We're set up for it. It wants to happen. And I just wanted to give you a tip of the hat for
Well,
being a
thank
part
you.
of that and for pushing it
Thanks.
forward and to give it a little thumbs up for all of our listeners.
Okay. Yeah, that's been a great project. It's really an amazing entrepreneurial venture. They've really thought through the pedagogy, the new technology, of course, all of the cost issues, and so on. So it's been really fun to be a part of that project. I know they have over 72, I think, thousand students, and they have an
Nice.
internal behind the scenes. Once you're a member, there are lots of discussion boards and it's amazing the quality of the discussions that go on there. Partly because you're not just anybody can just do a drive-by comment. People have taken the courses, listened to the lectures, they've paid money, so they're more serious about it. So that's been very wonderful. Now, I do think, at least in my thinking about the future of education, that's one of three models that I think works. So this is totally online. You go out, you look for the best professors you can in the subject areas, you bring them into the studio, and then you produce basically a Netflix series course with super production values, and you just put that out there. And for people who are self-motivated, self-directing, I think it's a perfect form of education. Plus, it's then got a community there where you can engage. The other models, though, I think the traditional models of education that will reinvent themselves. You mentioned St. John's, for example, that I do think Socratic, small group, in-person discussion is a viable model. There is nothing, I think, better than a professor in a one-on-one conversation with a smart, motivated student. That is so enriching for the student, and it is customized. The professor very quickly knows what the student knows and what the student doesn't know, where the fuzzy areas are, what the big questions are. That, I think, it's a very expensive model of education, but we're a rich country and we care about education. We can always come up with money for people who want that ideal form of education as well. I
The
think
best
also,
investment you can make.
possibly, yes. Yeah. I think there are lots of new hybrid models that are coming along as well. Some parts of education, I think, can be turned into commodities, so to speak. You want to learn another language, right? So they can develop programs that guide you through and make it fun, make it into a game, and so on. And then you get a certain amount of that, but then you get people in real life conversation with native speakers. So you put those two together as well. So I know there are some experimental programs where people say, what can online education do the best? And we'll do all of that. But then at the same time, after people have worked through that material for 6 months, 8 months, or whatever, then everybody comes to a campus for 2 weeks, a month.
Mhm.
They meet mentors. They have those in-person conversations. They get into the nitty gritty and so on. And then everybody goes their separate ways. So I think in one sense, we're living on the cusp of a new golden age of education. Now that everyone recognizes that a lot of the traditional models that are institutionalized have failed, some worse than others, and people are ready to try new things and to do some serious reform efforts. So, yes, that's interesting.
Dr. Hicks, I want to go back to um, something that you said about sort of I'll frame it as the postmodern choice to either abdicate objective reality altogether or um, decide that the science, the pursuit of understanding of the objective might be upgraded, whether with a better hypothesis or better mathematics or better um, something. And I just want to get your take on the limitations of choice B, the upgrading the science. And I'm thinking of something that my father, who is a molecular biologist and neurochemist, when I would ask, he would say, when I would ask, why is this way? He would say, well, science has nothing to say about why, only how. And why is not really for for debate. And he wasn't particularly interested in why. But to me, why is important. And I would love to hear about what you think about our access to knowledge that's not available through improvements on the scientific method, or maybe you believe that the scientific method might get upgraded to answer questions of why at some point. Or
Yeah.
tell us how you think about that.
So again, yeah, that's two closely related points. So on the first one, do we give up and say, the object science project is a failure and just abandon it, or do we go for the upgrade? And I think that partly is a philosophical issue, partly a psychological issue, the way Brian was pointing earlier. And here I think, again, by analogy to say romances, right? And maybe we've all experienced this as well. So, we start off somewhat hopeful and idealistic, and we're interested in dating, and we meet someone, and they're wonderful and special, and we fall totally in love with this person, and then it all goes to crap, right? And the whole relationship fails. Right? 6 months later, a year later, and it is devastating. And I think it is natural, right, to feel devastated in that situation. And maybe it's perfectly natural for someone in that moment to say, I'm never going to put myself out there again. This hurts too much. This is too painful. I don't believe in love or romance anymore, and I'm just going to totally set aside that as a part of my life. Versus someone who says, okay, this was terrible, but I will survive, and I will rebuild myself emotionally, and I can put myself out there again because I still believe love is possible, deep affection is possible, romance is possible. So, I understand that always on the big things, human beings are, when push comes to shove, psychologically primed to go either way. And it does become a personal choice which way one does want to go. So that's one part of the question that you were raising. So then we say, all right, suppose we then say, though, continue to believe in love, continue to believe in affection, romance, and so on. Or but continue to believe in objectivity, continue to believe in rationality, continue to believe in science. Are there limits to that project? Is it the case that there are perhaps some things that are part of the broader philosophical project that are not open to rational, objective, scientific analysis, or not? And so then you introduced the example of your father, who drew a pretty harsh line. It sounded like he would say something like, there are scientific facts, and they are non-evaluative, non-normative. That's just how it is, and we don't ask any sort of teleological questions about why or why it matters or some sort of grand meaning of the universe type of story. And again, I think that points us into a deep philosophical issue. No, I think an important part of it, I don't want to say that all of your question is to say there is a conception of science that says science is only about facts, it's not about values, right? Or that science is only about describing the world, descriptive, it's not about norms at all. So anytime you start talking about values and norms and good and bad, that's not scientific. That's got to be something else. And I, as a scientist, I'm going to stick to my focus here. And interestingly, that same kind of dichotomy also comes in a religious form, but they will typically take the other side of that dichotomy. They will say, yes, maybe science is interested in facts and truth and things that are amenable to logic and mathematics, but there also are values and morals and ethics and questions of ultimate meaning. And those are real questions, but we don't think science can answer them. So we need to use religion as the way that we explore all of those sets of issues. So what you end up with is a kind of dichotomy where you say, the facts are over here and all of the values are over here, and the scientists are dealing with the facts, but they stay totally out of anything normative. and then religious people say are totally focused on the normative, what it is to be a good person, but they have to say totally out of science and try not to describe the world in factual terms. And again, I think that's a false alternative. But again, it's an alternative that is deeply rooted in our tradition. So I am on the side of saying, and this is an Aristotelian point, that value questions and teleological questions are also a kind of factual question, but a more complicated factual question. So the same methods that generally speaking we use in the sciences, that is to say, being open to evidence, category schemes, doing experiments, and so on, to isolate things that are better or worse, good and bad, also apply in all of the value domains. And that ethics itself is a kind of science. So in this way, I would say Aristotle is exactly the right guy to go to first. And so I would point people initially to the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics. Yes. And then,
Eudaimonia.
well, eudaimonia is the capstone, but what he's doing in the first, comes in the later books. What he's doing there is trying to analyze value questions in terms of kind of a biological functionality. Right? So rather than saying the good is something disembodied in some other realm, as Plato wants us, or that some sort of divine revelations that come from a god, the good and the bad are rooted in what we need to function biologically in the world. And that's just a promissory note. Aristotle's got a whole book, right, devoted to this. We do see it, to come back to Nietzsche in part. I don't agree with much of Nietzsche, but he is, again, trying to naturalize the concept of good and bad. And you'll notice that maybe not, but when one reads Nietzsche, there is a whole lot of language about healthy and unhealthy, life affirming and life denying. And all of those biological metaphors come to the fore in Nietzsche's thinking. So what he's trying to do is, again, say ethics is not about social conventions, or we just subjectively feel various things, or we expect there to be divine pronouncements and so on. There are some modes of living that are healthier, and some modes of living for organic species that are unhealthy. Some are signs of growth, some are signs of decay. So what he is working toward is a naturalizing of values and ethics and putting it on a kind of psychobiological footing. And then mentioning the word foot, I actually should mention Ayn Rand in the middle part of the 20th century, very explicitly in the 1960s. She's a kind of an updated Aristotelian, trying to do the same sort of project, a naturalistic, objectively based ethic. So, when we do ethics, again, flying over the territory, we're looking for a distinction between the good and the bad. Are there facts of reality that can distinguish or help us distinguish the good from the bad? And, she points to the difference between life and death. And that, there's a difference between being alive and being dead, between acting in certain ways to develop your capacities to achieve values that keep you in existence versus those that destroy your capacities and lead you to physical and psychological. So we want to map good and bad onto what's life affirming and what's kind of leads you in the direction of death. And that's in the 1960s. And then also I'd recommend Philippa Foot, who published just before her death in 2001, a book called Natural Goodness. And it's one, I cover both Rand and Foot in my Peterson Academy courses on ethics, where Foot is coming out of a more academic tradition, Rand out of a more public intellectual tradition. But she's talking about this strong fact value dichotomy where kind of baked into so much of the academic world is this very skeptical conclusion that facts and values have nothing to do with each other. There's just this total dichotomy that you can't get from facts to values and so on.
From is
That
to ought is the famous way
from
that
is
gets put.
from is
Yeah.
to ought. So, baked into many philosophical traditions in their metaphysics is the idea that naturalism is a mistake, right? The naturalistic fallacy, as it is also sometimes called. And Foote is basically saying, no, that's a fallacy, right? Naturalism, there is a naturalistic basis for ethics. And what's interesting is that, again, she's looking biologically at species, their life modes, and trying then to kind of bootstrap our way up to humans as more complicated, but with a biological rooting. So instead of then saying, well, there's only facts and we have to be non-normative if we're going to be scientific and never address goodness and badness questions, or we have to do religion in some completely non-objective, non-scientific way, explore values and meanings and so forth. I'm in the tradition of saying that that's a false alternative, and we should find I don't know if I want to use the bridge metaphor, or that just to say that ethics is a complicated branch of science, and we are still working our way towards it. Maybe another way
William,
to look at it is to say, if you look at the development of the sciences in the modern world, when they kind of came online as mature sciences, physics was first to get there. Kind of before then, everything was like natural philosophy or supernatural philosophy, revealed philosophy or natural philosophy. And those interested in natural philosophy then said, well, here's this part of the world, reality. We can carve it out and study it. And we've got the tools to come up with good answers. And so physics, in the modern sense, is born. And then along come the chemists about a century later. This set of phenomena, we can get that one sorted out. Now we've got a periodic table and we know how to do the experiments. And it's not quite physics, it's not, and so on. So chemistry comes on board. And physics is in the 1500s and 1600s. Chemistry's on board by the 1700s. Then it's biology's turn in the 1800s. So all these big taxonomical schemes, quasi-evolutionary theory, more mature evolutionary theories, and then clearly by the end of the 1900s, biology is a science. And then we start to see at the turn of the 20th century people to say, well, if we're not thinking about the mind as a soul or some sort of disembodied spirit, that we're an integrated naturalistic organism, can we study the mind rationally, objectively, scientifically? And then we start to have the behaviorists and the Freudians right at the turn of the 20th century saying, now it's time for psychology to become a
right?
science. Right. And then
William
that
James.
on
Yeah.
board in the 20th century, William James as well. And then so from physics to chemistry to biology to psychology, my view then is ethics and value questions are another level of complexity, and that we are now at the ante-room of starting to see as people like Nietzsche, in some sense, Rand and Foote pointed us toward. So we're
In
getting
a
there.
way, you're describing the great chain of being, or what Jeffrey Moore called the infinite staircase, right? These kind of stacking layers of our understanding, kind of recapitulating these stacked layers of reality.
Yeah.
And when we've talked about that in the past, we've also noted that there are some miracles along that staircase,
Ah,
like the creation of the physical world to begin with, or the creation of consciousness, or consciousness conscious of consciousness, that you're kind of mapping there. Where I guess I'm not convinced that for example, that our understanding of biology answered some of the questions, and nor that it ever might. And that's okay. um, I'm not opposed to it achieving that. But it kind of goes back to where we started, and this idea of the external and the internal, and there the the methodology that you're describing might be a way of kind of externalizing as much as possible so as to understand it in that light, And I think we risk neglecting that there's this internal piece that might never be externalized and might never be understandable in that light.
Hmm. All right. Yeah. Again, that's a great question, a classic question, and a deep one. So, yeah, and I agree. So, if we then metaphysically go back to the very beginning of our conversation and kind of ask the in the beginning question, and we're already right back to metaphysics. And do we appeal to a creator brought the whole thing out of nothing, right? And try to explore that territory, or there was some unformed stuff and the creator molded and shaped it and set it on its way, or whether we don't talk about creators, we just backtrack from our current understanding of the world back through the billions, and right now we get to a big bang. And we say, well, what happened before the Big Bang? And we say, well, we don't know yet, right? That it might be that there was like earlier cycles of expansion, and then the whole universe, collapsed in on itself, and there was a big
Yeah.
crunch and then Big Bang. So there's just these eternal cycles, or maybe something else. So it's an ongoing scientific project. But so then we have exactly that's one big, huge right question, and then we say, well, out of perhaps inorganic stuff, we have this juncture where suddenly there's organic stuff as well. It starts to come along maybe 4 billion years ago. And we don't know how exactly that happened. And then we start to have these more complicated organic things that develop an awareness of their surroundings, right? And we're not quite sure how this initial awareness, right, develops sensation. And then, as you point out, some of them become aware of their awareness. There's self-awareness, and then maybe volition, the ability to regulate your own consciousness and awareness and direct your actions. And we don't know how far, right, all of that can go. So I think that's great, and ongoing scientific projects, and it is, I think, to some extent, an open question whether we will be able to answer all of those questions, or whether we will bump up against limits in various ways. And that's the first part of your observation question. The second part you were getting to was, I think it was more of an epistemological issue that it, I don't want to say that my methodology requires that all of the evidence that is legitimate only be external, kind of publicly available evidence. I think that's a behaviorist methodological claim. And in some forms of positivism, it's a positivistic methodological claim. And I don't think that's true. I think the mistake that they made was to say, well, look, whatever is going on internally in the subject, there's real stuff that is happening there. And our awareness of stuff that's going on, to go back to Brian's point about my stomach rumbling, as it is right now, I'm ready for a snack. I am aware of that, and that's evidence, that's data, and for me, at least, that is data that is as good as the evidence of my eyes, the evidence of my ears right now. And I think a legitimate part of a complete understanding of the human being will integrate the externally available evidence with the internally available evidence uh, to come up with a full scientific project. So then I think we're left with the question, is there anything internal to me that is something that I cannot know, or maybe I can have data, awareness of it, but it's not anything that's amenable to scientific analysis or any sort of objective analysis? And I would say I don't think so. I don't think there's any difference between um, awareness of internal states and awareness of external states. There's lots of things externally that I'm never going to know, right? Just a silly example. Aristotle, when he was, uh, on the island of Lesbos doing his studies, he had a neighbor, and his neighbor grew an olive tree, and one year the third olive fell off the tree, and it and it rolled and it landed somewhere. Where was that? Can we find this? I don't know that we will ever find that, right? It was a fact. It really happened. There was, he really had a neighbor. He really had an olive tree. There was some olive, the third one to fall off the tree that year, but that's probably outside the scope of our knowledge, just as there are lots of things internally that are going to happen that I'm going to have a glimmer of, but I'm never going to figure out what exactly that twitch was or what that feeling was, where it came from, and so on. Nonetheless, there's a huge amount that we can know, and a huge, both internally and internally. So extrospection and introspection, I think, are legitimate sources of evidence, and we're still in the process of developing the proper epistemological criteria for dealing with those.
Yeah. See, that kind of got to my Heidegger question from the back
Hmm.
end because uh, one of the things that I'm feel is relevant to the inside outside issues, be they psychological, philosophical, or religious, is this idea of hermeneutics. This idea that we have to go through a process of interpretation, and that process of interpretation is reiterative
Mm.
by
Oh, yeah.
inside, outside, inside, outside.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Maybe a
Great.
last question for you, Dr. Hicks.
Sure.
And um, the uh, I think of like the ultimate manifestation of the downside of postmodernism living right now in the political sphere as the union of Islamofascism and the Western left. And so this is like a very here and now political question for you, as opposed to we've spent a lot of
Yeah.
time in like epistemology and metaphysics. Um, are we close to turning the corner? What are you
Sure.
seeing? How do you interpret this strange horseshoe effect? And
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, yeah, it is from a philosophical perspective, a bizarreness. So you take Islam, particularly politicized Islamism, and it's like the most throwback, primitive form of pre-modernism possible. And so, many people who are, postmodern will start off by saying, no, I care about equality and women's rights and saving the planet and clean air and so on. And the Islamists are gay rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Islamists, right, will just execute after torturing, right, all of those people very, very quickly. So it's like the most pre-modern throwback possible. And then the same time, the postmoderns are claiming to be edgy and forward-looking and critical and non-dogmatic, et cetera, et cetera. So you just line them up, and it seems like they should be opposed to each other on everything and absolutely bitter, bitter enemies. And I think um, both of them are, at least at the strategic level, I think their strategists are aware of that, and that for them it really just is a marriage of convenience, right? I think they both expect to kill the modern West and then fight it out amongst themselves, and then they think that they will prevail. So I think it's at that level, at least among the smart people who are Islamists and the smart people who are postmoderns, it's a marriage of convenience. But that's not to say that there aren't millions of kind of foot soldiers among the woke postmoderns who they don't really know what's going on, and they're naive and silly, and they're just following orders to a large extent. Just show me where I'm supposed to show up to protest, and hopefully that cute girl will sleep with me after. I think it's really at that level of sophistication. But I think in a deeper way, it does make sense because both of them recognize that their stronger enemy is not the other one, that their stronger enemy really is the Enlightenment. It really is the Aristotelian, Baconian, optimistic, modern, naturalistic, progress, life can be beautiful view of the world. The postmoderns hate that. They're philosophically opposed to that. The Islamists hate that. They're philosophically opposed to that. And so I think what really is driving them is not is the question: whom do we hate more? And I think as much as a postmodern, an informed postmodern would hate an Islamist, they hate capitalism, liberalism, the Enlightenment more, and they would rather try to destroy that than anything else. And the same thing holds for the Islamists. You know, as much as they hate the postmoderns, I think for the most part, from their perspective, they just see them as a decadence, as a kind of childish. They don't stand for anything. They can't make anything. They can't build anything. So they're not a super serious enemy. The super serious enemy is the modern individualistic pursuit of happiness project, and that's what has to be destroyed. And they're perfectly willing to form a temporary alliance in order to achieve that. And this goes back now for to two generations. I think famously or infamously in 1978, Foucault, who's kind of the poster child for postmodernism, he was quite happy to go to Iran and spend some time writing. He didn't come out and say, I agree with Islamism, but he was using all of the celebratory phases. This is going to succeed. This is a new kind of revolution. You have to get into the spirit of things and welcome it and work with these people because they are our best weapon against, at least in this part of the world, our best weapons against the real enemy.
Yeah, and I would argue that they're on the same project in the relationship between the inside and the outside, a sort of a rejection of the outside for using the inside, particularly whether it's religious or philosophical. It's putting that outside, the reality of the outside world, at a distance. And so they're blood brothers in that respect, I would say.
No, I think that's well said.
You didn't speak to the part of the question that was, is the bizarreness of that union and this moment perhaps a sign that we're near a breaking point or near
Yes.
a shift?
Yeah, you want me to consult my crystal ball and predict the future here?
Is this a hangover, or are we still drunk?
I'm a cautious optimist about the future on all of this, and I am happy to say. So here we are in 2026, that I made two predictions, each one about 10 years apart, and I think they are being borne out. The first prediction I made was I started giving interviews when my Explaining Postmodernism book came out in 2004. And there, the form of the question was more academic, a little more intellectual, right? So postmodernism has been around for a while. You've written this book about it. Is postmodernism over, and are we turning the corner? And at that point, I was saying things like, well, I think postmodernism is dead intellectually. But it is not dead institutionally, and it's not dead culturally. And so my position then was to say, well, by the time my book came out, 2004, postmodernism intellectually had been, for a generation, say, going back to the generation of Foucault and so on. And already by then, you were starting to see that there weren't any new arguments being developed. That when you read postmodern articles and it's just the same verbiage, the same tropes, the same thing being cycled and recycled and so on. And so intellectually, there's not anything new. And so it's in that sense dying intellectually. And I think that has been borne out. So here we are 20 years later, and there's still nothing new intellectually coming out from postmodernism. But philosophy and other disciplines are taking up the mainstream real philosophical questions, and there's a lot of vigorous discussion and debate, as there should be, about philosophy. So philosophy has not died; it's going on, and all these other philosophical perspectives are ongoing. But there's nothing significant coming out of postmodernism there. But postmodernism was institutionalized by then, right? Lots of tenured professors, who are going to be around for a while. Lots of, as I think of them, captured institutions like the high art world and various other places where postmodernism, right, had a lock on those cultural institutions. Um, and those are going to have their run, right, until those tenured professors retire, hopefully without reproducing themselves in the next generation of the professorate, right? But there's a long tail effect that has to occur there. And then the other part then is not just the institution, but the cultural part. And then what we started to see, as was the next phase, was about 10 years later, around 2015, where postmodernism was clearly not just an intellectual movement in the universities and the colleges, but it was spilling out into the culture. And suddenly we've got kind of postmodern takes on race relations and postmodern takes on feminism and postmodern this, that, and the other thing. And kind of anybody who has a Twitter feed or is on social media starts to be aware that postmodernism is everywhere. And parents are looking at their kids coming home from school saying, what on earth are they teaching, right, my kids these days? And parents are starting to get activated. And Jordan Peterson is starting to stand up, and Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt saying there's something very sick and rotten inside the academic world and it's spilling out. And suddenly those guys are not just nerd academics in the ivory tower, they are public intellectuals, and everybody around the world is aware of them. So postmodernism culturally is a force, and everybody then is engaging with the debate. And so I noticed at that point, and my publisher noticed there was a strong resurgence of sales of my book, uh, starting around 2015. And so I started to be in demand again for people to say, what is this postmodernism thing? And blah, blah, blah. And is it almost over? Right. And at this point, the question
We
was
had
not,
enough.
is it over intellectually, but now we're fighting the culture wars and we're fighting the institutional wars. Will cancel culture win, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, I was saying things, well, this was my prediction in the mid to late teens, that again, I don't think it's an intellectual force, but it is a cultural force. It has captured various institutions. It is going to be ugly for the next decade or so, and vicious and nasty. Partly that's because of the kinds of rhetorical and other tools that postmodernism brings to the debate. It's not about rational discussion and evidence-based debate and so forth. So it is going to be ugly, but I think now that people are becoming informed, and we're going to have a big public debate about this, and we will start to see some of the negative practical manifestations of postmodernism in the schools, in the culture, in politics, and so on. After that period, we will see signs of improvement. And I think that we should be able to win that debate. We're smart enough, we're rich enough, we're still open enough as a culture to learn, even though we've had this negative uh, pathology built up in our culture. We can figure out ways to solve the problem. So I have been encouraged then to say now, it is 10 years later, and I think there are strong signs that postmodernism in its cultural manifestation forms are on the defensive, right? So, woke is on the defensive, and there are lots of reactions and new forms in various forms, and we're fighting back against various sorts of institutionalized double standards, the institutionalized racisms, and we're getting rid of a lot of very sickly academic departments that weren't actually interested in knowledge seeking and educating students. They're on their way out. So there's a huge reform movement that's going on. And I think it's partly a reform movement informed by this new anti-liberal, in the broad sense, anti-rational, anti-healthy movement, and so we will be more immune to it as future iterations go on. Now, I don't think we've won the battle yet. Postmodernism had 2 or 3 generations intellectually. It's had at least 2 generations institutionally in some of our very important institutions. And it takes a long time to reform those institutions or to entrepreneurially start up new ones that are going to take their place. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that we have turned the corner. So I'm not cautiously optimistic. I'm moderately optimistic now about intellectual and cultural trends.
Thank you. That's a nice way of ending with moderate optimism. Dr. Hicks, it was such a
Uh,
pleasure to have you.
Oh, good. No, it's a pleasure for me too. Great questions. Yeah. This is how philosophy should be, right?
Yeah, I learned something, and that's what I'm here for. So,
Great.
thank you so much. Would love to have you back sometime. We're going to ask for your address too, so we can send you a Fools and Sages mug, to thank you
Ah,
for
nice.
joining us. And yeah, all the best to you, and keep fighting the good fight.
Great, great. Now, and keep up your good projects. You guys have a lot of interesting conversations under your belt. This is good stuff. Yeah. All right, guys. We'll talk later.
Take care.
Thank you.